finally getting to share this. So, a much-needed disclaimer first. English isn't my first language. I'm Italian, so apologies in advance for any grammatical horror I may end up giving birth to while typing this down. This happened in the summer of 2007. It was told to me by the two girls who experienced it, who were friends of mine at the time, and also a couple. This is important for later. It all happened in central Italy, in Lazio, the region where Rome is, and I need to give some context about it. The area around Rome is full of hills. Most of that region is, and underneath many of these hills sit ancient Roman/pre-Christian catacombs. So many, in fact, that they're not even that big of a deal for the locals, and some of these catacombs even got converted into wine cellars or basements over the centuries. Some haven't. Again, this is important for later. Now, these two girls, which we'll call E and C, were in their early 20s, had been together for a year or so back then, and given how ludicrously expensive rents in Rome are, decided to try their luck finding a flat in one of the small towns around that area, on those hills I've mentioned. Mind you, those hills aren't ominous at all. If you've ever seen pictures from Tuscany, that's what they look like, which is rather lovely. And they did find a small apartment for rent in one of those towns, a renovated flat on the second floor of a much older house, which isn't surprising at all in that region, as many houses are centuries old and just get renovated from time to time. On the ground floor of that apartment there were some neighbors, but they never got to see too much of them, a couple of apartments with old people living in them. There was also a very old, sturdy wooden door which was always closed and locked by a padlock, and when they asked the landlord where it led, he told them it was the door to some old cellar nobody really used anymore, and supposedly was connected to one of the catacombs I've mentioned earlier. Again, it's an ancient country and such things don't come across as particularly weird to us. Neither it did to E and C, who just shrugged it off like, okay, makes sense. So E and C spent a few months in that town, not really bonding with anyone, mainly commuting from there to Rome and back to work and study. However, being a sexual couple in an old town full of old and bigoted people, they quickly started noticing how unwelcome they really were there. They'd go to the local store to buy food, and the clerk would ignore them on purpose. They'd find their mailbox emptied and all of their mail scattered over the floor outside their apartment. They'd even bump into people riding scooters around town, passing them by and yelling, "God damn." In short, they didn't have the best time there, but they knew it was only a temporary solution, so they decided to just endure it all while waiting to move again. And yes, FYI, Italy is still majorly conservative on the topic of LGBTQ, even more so than now, 16 years ago. Then, one morning, as she was stepping outside to go to the car and drive to Rome, E found something on the ground right in front of their flat's door. A mussel shell had been placed there, with a doused red candle in it. And judging by the mess it made, and how short the candle was by now, it had been burning for the whole night. Not knowing what to do with it, she picked up the shell with the candle and threw it in the garbage, together with all the wax she could scoop up from the floor. Another thing she noticed when she finally set out to leave was that that door, the sturdy wooden door downstairs that had always been closed up to that point, wasn't locked anymore. The padlock was gone, and it was opened just by a crack, but she didn't really pay much attention to it right then. But then, things started happening. At first, it was an uneasy feeling. E and C would be in their living room, sitting on the couch, reading, chatting, watching a movie, and suddenly they'd have this feeling like someone was watching them. Later on, it became more than that. They'd hear noises around the house, like someone knocking on the walls in another room, or the toilet flushing on its own, water taps turning on by themselves in the kitchen. Quickly, it became less than bearable. One night, as they were sleeping, they both woke up in the middle of the night, hearing the footsteps of bare feet in their living room. They started listening. It felt like the footsteps were simply pacing around, and there was nothing else. No voices, no items being moved, just the sound of bare feet in their living room. After a while, C, feeling understandably scared, whispered, "What's that?" to E. And as she did, the footsteps stopped, as if noticing her voice in the silence of the apartment. They stopped, and a split second later they started sprinting towards their bedroom. E grabbed C and turned her face away from the door, doing so herself just moments before the footsteps came through their bedroom's door and stopped to the side of the bed. "Don't look. Whatever happens now, don't look," E told C, and held her in her arms for the rest of the night, neither of them sleeping, just listening in for those footsteps to finally leave, or whoever it was to do something. Anything at all. But nothing happened. They spent the next 3 hours wide awake in silence until dawn came, and with that bit of sunlight finally shining through, E found the courage to turn around. And nothing was there. Another night, E, who was in university at the time, was up late studying in their living room as C was sleeping. Like I said before, it was summer, and the window in the living room was open. She wasn't facing it. The window was to her left as she was sitting at the table taking notes. Suddenly, she felt the hair at the back of her head stand, and had that familiar feeling of being watched, so she instinctively turned to the window. She described what she saw as a completely pitch-black, human-like figure, perched on the windowsill, with no features on its face save for 2 very large orange glowing eyes, who just stood there motionless and stared at me. She couldn't tell me for how long she stared at it. She told me she felt completely paralyzed and helpless, and had the feeling that, had she tried to move or do anything, that thing would have lunged at her. Eventually, she couldn't hold it anymore, turned around and closed her eyes, took a long, deep breath, and looked again. And it was gone. After that, they contacted their landlord and decided to leave for good. They did so within a week since that event. The last thing E noticed as they were finishing packing their things up and leaving was that big wooden door, the one who had been left open ever since all of those events had begun, was now once again closed and locked shut with a padlock. My boyfriend saw me, but it wasn't me. Hey y'all. So, I'm writing this in a bit of a panic because some weird stuff just happened, and it reminded me of a strange experience my boyfriend had a while back. We live in a ground-level apartment in Nashville, with good security, key cards to access the buildings. A while back, maybe like 6 months ago, my boyfriend called me around 2 p.m. on a weekday with a strange question. He asked me if I was standing outside our front door. I responded with the truth, which was that I was at work still. He started fully freaking out, saying that he was playing RimWorld and heard a loud knock at the door. He checked the peephole and saw who he thought was me, allegedly wearing the same clothes I'd left in that morning, but I never use our front door. I have a key, so I'd let myself in, and not to mention I was 20 minutes away in an office. He said that when he heard the knock and started approaching the door, he got a sort of sickly feeling, like something was wrong. And when he looked through the peephole and saw me, he almost threw up from the feeling. This figure standing at the door was wearing a lanyard like I wear for work, dressed in the same clothes, all that, but her head was down, and she was standing in a way that he described as really off. He was too scared to look through the peephole again, and just hunkered down in the living room while we stayed on the phone. Also, disclaimer here, my boyfriend is a bit of an over-exaggerator at times, so I acknowledge that. But I am also a firm believer in the spooky things in life, having my own paranormal experiences throughout the years with ghosts and cryptids. So, fast forward to today, we're gaming at like midnight, and I hear a loud knock at the door. He didn't hear it, but I waited to see if there was another and decided it was probably just him knocking his chair into his desk or something. 10 minutes later, there's another knock, and we both hear it this time. We look at each other, and then go to the door to look out. There's no one there, but there is a spot to the left of our door that isn't visible through the peephole, so I tell him not to open the door to check in case someone is there waiting for that very thing to happen. I go to close the blinds and keep listening for anything strange, but nothing else comes. This whole thing brought up the previous story of my apparent doppelganger, and I wanted to post it here in case anyone had any similar experiences with mimic-type things in urban areas. I myself had a run-in with a Wendigo when I lived up north, but I find it hard to believe those or skinwalkers would be here in the metro area. Anyone have any input, similar stories, or general info on what this could have been standing on the other side of our door that day? Camping trip, 2014. This happened to me and my girlfriend I was dating back in the summer of 2014. This all took place in South Carolina, and my girlfriend and I wanted to take a camping trip. We initially tried to go to a place 45 miles from our hometown, but they were going to charge us double what we thought we were going to pay for. We decided to head back, and it just occurred to me there's a spot in very close to where we live. Now, I will say it's more boondocking and off-grid. We didn't have to pay for anything, just parked the car and we got out. This place is quite gorgeous. There's a historic bridge and trail, also some of the oldest railroad tracks in the South. We got there before sunset, so we had plenty of time to pitch the tent and set everything up. There were a few cars when we arrived, but they were most likely hikers and would be gone by nightfall. The only thing that made us uncomfortable was a busted up and rusted old white van with no license plate. We both pointed that out, thinking it was weird, but we shrugged it off and started walking to a good place to set camp up. After several hours, around 3 a.m., following some quality time spent with her and taking in all the nature and then going to sleep, we started to hear this obscure singing and walking around our tent. Anytime you hear commotion that early in the morning, nothing good can happen out of it. I peered my head out the tent to see what was going on. I didn't see anything or anyone, but nonetheless, I didn't want to stay in that area when we both were freaked out. Just because I couldn't see it doesn't mean it's not there. I barely did a decent walk around our tent. As we were quietly gathering our belongings, we swore we heard the singing get louder. I recall words in this song he was singing had, "Now won't you'll come out," followed by this raspy laughing. Once we finally packed the tent, that was when crunching on the leaves and his humming is what we heard, so we knew this guy was close by. We booked it. I grabbed her hand and threw the tent and folding chairs on my back. We made sure to run the opposite way from where all his noise was coming from. Luckily, we set camp up fairly close to the parking lot because I could see lights through the trees. As we ran and scurried away from whoever was chasing us, we noticed the lights from the parking lot wasn't just the street lights, but also, to our horror, it was that old rusty white van we saw at the beginning. We hurried uphill just hoping this guy was alone. His van was right in front of mine. If he had an accomplice, that would be another person to deal with. As we reached the lot, we got into the bright streetlights. I noticed my girlfriend's hand make a slight twitch, and her pace slowed down. From that, I could tell she was turning her head to take a look at our attacker. I heard her gasp loudly, "Come on, don't look, we're almost there." She focused back, and we continued running in unison. This guy was getting closer, as I can hear the noise of the gravel intensify. I heard his wheezing and him barking, "Don't y'all think you'll get away?" As we just made it past the van, we split, and I handed her the keys so she could unlock us, start the car, and I can throw all the gear in the trunk, and we can make it out of this place. As I frantically laid the camping gear in the back seat and head to the driver's side, that was when my body faced forward for the first time in a while. Every noise this guy was making was close and amplified now. With the car running, I kept my head down to put it in reverse, but curiosity got the better of me. In the brightness of my headlights, this man was a behemoth with a stern, wrinkled face with red, patchy hair, a goatee that had dirt and crud smeared over it. His eyes were fixated on us like a scope magnifying on two 10-point bucks. He was wanting to kill. "Get back here!" he barked, waving a baseball bat back and forth. I shook my head, and with that I swerved out, and we were on the way out with our hearts racing. In the rearview mirror, we saw the man slam the bat in frustration. A narrow escape. We drove to Waffle House and spent the rest of the early morning until the sunrise. A call from my sister. My older sister is a thru hiker and goes backpacking often. We grew up in Appalachia in a very remote area. Growing up poor, we spent a lot of time camping, and now that we're older, she lives closer to home and regularly goes camping with my parents. We've had our fair share of bear and wildcat encounters, but nothing like this has happened before. Today, I called out of work with a stomach bug. I woke up from a nap, and my sister texted me asking if she could give me a call. I live about 5 hours away, so I immediately said yes, fearing it was an emergency. When I answered, I could hear her footsteps very fast and her hurried breath in the phone. She said that she was in a ridge taking photos of a cave system she found near a large rock formation. When she made it to a clearing, she heard a man call her name. It echoed through the woods. It was then that she reached out to me. While I was talking to her, I could hear my dad's voice in the background. She said that she was still an hour from her camp. When she said she was alone, I felt the iciest feeling down my neck. I asked her what the man's voice sounded like. She paused and said, it sounded like several voices at the same time, but the loudest sounded like Dad. I stayed with her on the phone all the while, hearing something that was trying to sound like my dad. He's a lifetime smoker and very tall, so he has a low, booming voice that I have always found comforting up until now. When she got to the campsite, I told her that I was hearing it the entire time and thought he was there with her. She laughed and thought I was trying to tease her, but once she believed me, we were both rightfully spooked after that. My dad is very much alive and well. Does anyone know what entity would do this and how she can protect herself while she's alone in her tent tonight? What the F happened in those woods? Cursed land? Haunted forest? This is a true story, and I've been kind of obsessing over WTF happened out there. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible without leaving out key details. My wife's uncle, Jay, bought some land just north of Spokane, Washington with a friend of the family, Kay. They got it at a significant discount because a nearby aluminum smelter had polluted the ground and it was impossible to use the water beneath the ground. They had set up 2 plots and each had a camper to live in. Jay had been progressively getting paranoid and saying people were stalking him and watching him in the trees. About 3 months into living there, a man wandering through the woods there had an interaction with Jay and ended up attacking him and breaking his jaw. Upon being arrested, the man said he was overcome with the desire to see if he could kill him with a single punch. 2 months later, Jay was murdered in his sleep on the couch in his camper. Kay found him and immediately ran as far away until he stopped to call the police. There was sufficient evidence of who did it, and they quickly caught the killer, who was a 19-year-old boy who said he simply wanted his bike. He beat him to death with a power tool that was lying on a floor nearby, completely bashed his brains in. Kay was completely terrified at all times to be there alone. He had moved in with a family member, until 8 months later, he ended up with nowhere else to go and had to return. In constant fear, he finally convinced my pregnant wife and I to come stay with him. The second I turned off the highway onto the property, I was overcome with dread. There were at least 250 crows covering the dirt road up to the property. I didn't sleep whatsoever the first night. I stared into the forest, searching for the cause of my intense fear. The energy of this place was so uncomfortable, and I assumed it was simply just knowing Uncle Jay was killed here. Even the days were eerie. Never did I have a moment where I didn't feel watched here. My wife and I always had the sense of fear, especially after dark. Things sort of normalized for a while until one day Kay began puking and feeling very lightheaded all the time. I took him to the hospital and they said he was fine, probably a flu. At this point, it was the anniversary of Jay's murder. 3 days after the date of Jay's death, Kay comes running out of his camper screaming, "I can't breathe," waking my wife and I up, and we run out to see what's wrong. Kay had gotten into his car and floored it, crashing into a nearby tree. I run up and peer through the window to see the most intense and most primal fear I've ever seen in someone's eyes. He was gasping and clutching his chest. Moments later, he breathed out one last time and he was dead. We gave him CPR for 30 minutes until EMS arrived. On July 10th, 1 year and 3 days after moving there with Jay, and they were both dead. Now it's only me and the wife alone on the property. Every moment living in fear and not understanding what had happened here. IDK why we didn't leave right away. One day I come out to get fresh water from a drum we kept for water to smell the worst smell I'd ever smelled. The water container had a 1-inch opening on top, and inside the water was bits and pieces of chipmunks, like spines and heads. They didn't fall in. Something ripped them apart before putting them inside. The nights were getting worse and worse. I never saw anything, just always filled with unease and intense fear. I grew up deep in the mountains of North Idaho, with the nearest town being 30 miles away. Fear in the woods, even at night, is new for me. hearing crashing and footsteps every night. One night, my wife and I returned home to having the worst feeling I've ever felt. Everything looked different, although everything was right where we left it. Nothing seemed in place. Looking around, I suddenly see this orange, long-haired, manged cat sitting on a stump. This cat's eyes were so intense, fiery, almost glowing, but not quite. We start hearing branches snapping, pine needles crunching, seemingly from every direction. I'm still staring at this cat, almost frozen in fear. Suddenly a voice breaks out, echoing throughout the forest. "Hello? Is anyone out here?" A little girl, I thought, but something was off. My wife yells back, "Hello, are you okay?" "Anybody?" The voice had changed. "Help, help me!" We yell back several times without response. "Somebody help me!" The most intense, shrieking, evil-sounding voice of a woman. I'm filled with more intense fear than I can ever describe, but my wife, she is overcome with the need to find this person, and she started to head off into the forest without a word. I grabbed her by the arm and tell her something isn't right. Why won't she respond to us? She tries to break free from me, to go off alone. I tell her to get into the truck and I'll grab the spotlights. We aren't going on foot. We roll the windows down and shine my intensely bright LED lights throughout the forest. We slowly creep down the road, yelling back. As we get further down the road, the voice strikes out, "Please, won't anyone king help?" Sounds are difficult to pin down in the woods, but this one was very close. I hit the brakes and stop immediately. We shine the lights and yell back, searching. No sign of anyone, when suddenly the voice explodes into the cabin of the vehicle as if they were standing right outside my window. "Help! Me! Somebody help!" Leaving my ears hurting and ringing. I hit the gas and didn't look back. Called the police when I hit the highway, and afterwards they said there was no one around. I picked up our stuff the next day, and my wife gave birth the following day. We never stayed there again after the baby was born. What the hell could do these things? I never even believed in paranormal things before, but IDK, what else happened?